We are on to agenda item 3.1. This is our board member message, and this month, Member Boggess has our message. So please, Member Boggess.
Thank you, Chair Hymas. I appreciate that. And thanks to Kelsey and the crew who helps get this up so that it works. Our guys were here late last night. I saw them here working, and I just want to express my appreciation for that. I want to tell you a story about a man named Dennis. It wasn't all that long ago that I was having a conversation with a man named Dennis, and I noticed a lot of things about this man. Not only was he most definitely academically inclined, he was very much so a genius. You could tell in the conversation that he was a genius, and he had a special way of viewing the human condition and conversing about the human condition. And when I complimented him on that, he said, "Well, you do know the genius plows the field." Dennis was a farmer, a very successful farmer, which in this day and age, you don't see very many farmers not dependent on the government for their operation to run. And he reminded me during the course of this conversation that if you cannot read the Federalist Papers, you are in fact not a genius. And he had this conversation with me, and we exchanged some witty repartee, and I reminded him that at least 7 times a year Facebook tells me I am a genius. So I didn't know whether or not we should take Facebook's determination or the fact that I do read and understand the Federalist Papers. But he reminded me that the genius plows the field. And in the course of our conversation, we had lots of conversations about, or lots of repartee rather, about our founders and about the course of education, because that's why I was there and that's why he was there. And Benjamin Rush said the only means of establishing and perpetuating our Republican form of government is the universal education of our youth in the principles of Christianity by means of the Bible. And that worked for a long time, till it was usurped by people with authoritarian aims. And we saw that come in not in the 1900s, but in the 1800s. And I don't know if you've all noticed, but our state has a few issues. I'm sure all of you see it. Recently, we were ranked #1 in corruption. It's not something that's a secret. It perpetuates the interweb. It trends on Twitter, and people talk about it. But I want to talk about one thing in particular today that I see in this state, and I've seen it since I got here, and that's the ill-defined word of choice for browbeating others into singular thinking, behaving in a communist-like manner. And that word is division. Another word that's commonly used in this state is contention. And it's ill-defined and used in ill manners to browbeat people into submission, and it's wrong. And there are many people in this room and throughout this state that are afraid of criticism or disagreement. I would argue that perhaps they're even crippled by it. In fact, not only can they not have hard conversations in person, it is common in this state for people to read into internet posts and the like and internalize that content to fit their own shortcomings, their own failures, their own insecurities. Then they pick up and call people. They pick up the phone, they call people, obviously not the source, and behaving like a middle school child, they claim offense under a veil in an attempt to guise gossip as seeking clarity, focus, and understanding. Intelligent people see through these behaviors, and I have to sit and contemplate with myself what God sees, because that terrifies me. What God sees in comparison to the standard he sets, I think should horrify everyone. And I don't know what causes some to be so fearful to walk as Jesus did and lead the way he led. Jesus was the epitome of love, yet along the journey, he and his disciples were really great at making people angry. It's in history and it's in the Bible. We don't like to talk about it, but it's true. They were overwhelmingly bold and accountable. His apostles, too, were excellent at division. Consider Acts 20:26 among so many scriptures when Paul told the elders of this town that their blood was not on his hands. On the right side of that divide, people were saved by the thousands. Life after rejection of the world and its ways to follow Jesus almost always comes after division. And the sanctification journey may be different for everybody, but it is under the same set of values, and those values are not negotiable. And it is not a Christian crime to discuss them openly. If we look at how the apostles died, do we really think that they got there by being complacent? Compliant? Do we think they got to the place they died through compromise? By refusing to point out fraud, misunderstanding, or errant theology? The list is long. Look at what the apostles said to the flock. It wasn't effeminate. They were leaders, fishers of men, effective and esteemed men of God, but they were brutal at times, both in person and in writing, and one might call them divisive. One might call them defensive. One might call them offensive. And one might call them contentious. The horror. But the Bible describes their behavior as an act of love, to speak such bold truth into the world. And as believers, we have to ask ourselves hard questions and be accountable to hard truths. Consider the calling of Apostle Paul in Acts 9:16, interwoven into the words of Ananias, "Well, I will show you how much you must suffer for my name's sake." Don't those words just scream conflict-free existence to you? For freedom and liberty to prevail, there must be division. There will be conflict. And there will be contention. It is a part of the process. So may we all use these words cautiously, and may we cease to use it as a part of a bad Bible buffet to champion the submission from those with whom we disagree. As believers, we are to be peace pursuers. The Hebrew writer tells us in chapter 12, verses 14 and 15, that we are to be pursuers of peace, like a lion hunts down his prey. But nowhere in Scripture does it say, "Blessed are the peace achievers." We are to be peacemakers, and that might bring reconciliation, but it doesn't always bring agreement, and we cannot continue to conflate the two. So while this is a vital part of the Christian existence, we can't throw a party at the out-of-context Bible buffet to browbeat other people. Heroes of the faith were boiled in oil. They were drowned upside down in wells and crucified. Some left families behind to share the gospel. Fast forward hundreds of years in 1776, others risked their lives, their fortune, their sacred honor for freedom under this banner. Yet in today's Western culture, we don't want to risk a week in jail or a fine, or God forbid, offense. The horror that we might offend somebody by seeking freedom and liberty. And I would argue that we are cowards and that we need to own it. It seems that non-believers are more courageous in this day and age than those who claim the name of Jesus. And I fear the narrative that Matt Walsh wrote in The Church of Cowards is far too real in America today, that if heathens came to scour the land for authentic Christians, not only would they be hard-pressed to find one, when one was discovered, the masses would cry and claim, "He isn't one of us." It's legitimately tragic, and it is odd to me that even those with a clear biblical understanding that Satan is the father of lies, that governments are corrupt, and that Satan is the ruler of this world, will also assert that publicly questioning the government narrative, their practices, and universal truth is somehow unchristian. We need to get a hold of ourselves, and then we need to read the entirety of Scripture and the whole counsel of God. And we need to think on what Jesus and his apostles actually did and said, because it was not always kosher. And I would challenge us today that truth cannot be sacrificed at an altar of pretend tolerance, and that it also inherently divides. I want to introduce you to a man. This is my grandfather. And I don't know how many of you recall when the Japanese internment camp was presented at National History Day on the Hill. And they presented it in this room, and I just almost lost it. Because this man was interned in one of those internment camps. And you don't know how profoundly that affects you till you see it on a screen when somebody studies history. And last night, as I was preparing for this, I looked for my grandfather's name on the list of people interned during World War II, and it was, I can't describe to you the experience, seeing his name on the screen and knowing that he lived through one of the most grotesque violations of civil liberties in the United States history. It's horrifying. And when I was a little girl, I listened far too little to what this man had to say about freedom and liberty. But I remember one thing very clearly, and that was that he spoke about enduring a horrible injustice on behalf of a nation that he loved. Can you imagine? And then he would always say that we needed to know what freedom was and to fight for it, and to never cease fighting for freedom. I had another grandfather who taught me many things. He taught me the love of bluegrass music, Western culture, and that cowards are the first to walk through the gates of hell. And that is seen in Revelation 21:8. And when I was in D.C. this summer, I was able to meet someone. You know, I'm not really a fangirl of celebrities. If I met Tom Cruise, I would probably force him to buy me dinner and debate the inerrant theology of L. Ron Hubbard. It's not really something that I do. But when I meet people like Yeonmi Park, it is something that profoundly affects you. And if you don't know who Yeonmi is, she is a North Korean defector. She was born into the communist country of North Korea, and by the age of 13, she had been trafficked to China. She ended up, through a Christian organization, getting to safety, and eventually she immigrated to America and got a degree at Columbia. And her speech was harrowing. She talked about a youth where she walked by people on the streets, but they weren't homeless, they were dead. That her life was normalized in that this is just how the world lives. And she spoke to us about so many things. But the one thing she said that I cannot forget is that if we do not think about the policy we pass, we create markets. And her example was China's one-child policy. She spoke boldly and charismatically about how China passed a one-child policy, and if you don't know what that is, it's basically where they were only allowed to have one child, but because the man was valued greater than the female, there was a whole generation of Chinese nationals who didn't have enough women to marry. And through this one-child policy, they created a human trafficking market where North Korean women were sold as sex slaves and wives to Chinese men. And when we don't think our policy through to its logical conclusion, we will lose. When we don't think about what we're doing when we allow sexually explicit materials in schools, and we don't think about the market we're creating when people seek out porn in their 20s, we are not doing our job in this room. And we pass lots of policy, but I don't think we think it through to its logical conclusion, and we certainly don't think about 30 years from now. And she begged with the policymakers in the room to think about 30 years from now. She beseeched us to think about what will happen when you create a market. The other thing she said that I just absolutely cannot get over, it was profound to me, was that communism is always on the agenda. She sat in a room full of policymakers and she said it's always on the ballot, and make no mistake about it, communism is always on the agenda. It's in every motion, every action item, and every word. And then she asked us how often we vote no. I was proud to say often. She argued that we need to be aware of how communism manifests in United States policy. Because her argument is not that communism is on the horizon, her argument is that it's here. And I would agree with her. And so if you don't understand these words, it's imperative that you do. Communism is on the agenda. Fascism is on the agenda. Maoism is on the agenda. Authoritarianism, Marxism, Stalinism, collectivism, socialism, liberalism. She begged us to understand how these things manifest in United States policy. And she talked to us boldly about being bold in the space of complacency in United States policymaking. If you don't know who Ted Kaczynski is, he is the Unabomber. And despite the fact that he did morally reprehensible things, he wrote a manifesto that many called a work of genius. Others called precisely correct in many of his ideas. And what he warned about was not all the things people thought he did. If you actually read his manifesto, he's warning about a technocratic state and the rise of communism. We have many people today that are sounding warning bells about communism in America, and they're not people who were born here, they were people who came here. Z. Van Fleet wrote Mao's America, and she speaks so boldly in what she calls a dire warning to the citizens of the United States that she has seen 2 cultural revolutions in her lifetime, one driven by Mao during her childhood and another one into America today. And she calls the similarities, quote, stunning. And then we have Yeonmi Park, who told us when she spoke that she's still searching for freedom in America. Those are profound words when you listen to them from someone who was trafficked as a sex slave, and she's searching for freedom in America. And her book is quite profound. And she spoke to us so boldly. And this girl learned English by watching Friends, so her sense of humor was very, very cute. Very cute. And she said, you know, you guys teach your children to eat bugs because it will somehow save the planet. And she said, you need to stop that because the children in North Korea are serving your time. Because that's all they have to eat. Sometimes 2 bugs a day is what they get. You want to buy bugs for food, ship them to North Korea because the children need to be fed. And I had never seen anyone, let alone a woman, speak with such profound boldness that just wrestled with your soul. She was amazing. And she spoke overwhelmingly that when we normalize the abnormal, we become accustomed to living in madness. When we pretend that pornography for children is normal, we become accustomed to living in madness. When we pretend that schools should be about health care and mental health, we become accustomed to living in madness. And there are many cries to the people of the Western world, but one reigns louder than any, and it's from the Czechoslovakian people. And it came from a man who said, live not by lies. Refuse to live by lies. Refuse to follow the lies and speak truth into a world of madness. And I know that this is the time where everybody says, oh, you know, this is McCarthyism, Red Scare. Well, I don't know if you know this or not, but McCarthy was right. And if you're intellectually lazy, ChatGPT agrees with me. If we look at history and we look at what happened in the early 1900s in America, and we look at what happened during McCarthy's era, history proved they were right. We don't have people coming to this nation searching for freedom and crying out to the American people, communism is here, because they want to be famous. These people receive death threats. They don't live well. And so I would ask all of us to say today that we are going to stop the advancement of communism in our halls, in our walls, and in our policy. Because communism is always on the agenda. And I have been boldly told that how I speak isn't an attractive trait in a woman. Classy, I know. And my response to those people is cowardice is only cute on The Wizard of Oz. When it comes to this subject and the revolution that is occurring in our nation, I know that some of us only have 2 brain cells to rub together, and even so, some are still running and chasing after one of them. But I beg all of us, if you can't catch that second brain cell, purchase it and add courage to your cart, because communism is always on the agenda. How often do you vote no? And if you are sitting here today and you continue to be stumped by this message, my advice is to sit down and read all of the Federalist Papers. Challenge yourself to understand them on the intellectual level of the farmers to whom they were written, because maybe then we will all be as equipped as the geniuses who plow the field. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Member Boggess.